Okay, guys. So this is just a quick little lecture to kind of help reinforce American foreign policy within Latin America during the Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson administrations. Each president had their own unique way of dealing with foreign policy. So this is just to kind of recap what you should have already read in Topic 11, Lesson 7, to complete your Latin American chart. Your Latin American imperialism chart that was due today in class. So, taking a look here, starting out with Teddy Roosevelt. Now, we know that Teddy Roosevelt is a very charismatic leader during the progressive era, and he's going to bring some of that same charisma and kind of same stubborn nature to his foreign policy. He first gets the nickname as the peacemaker because in 1906 he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for helping to negotiate a peace between Russia and Japan. You might recall from reading that Russia and Japan had gone to war over the territory of Manchuria. Russia was concerned about Japanese growing aggression within Asia, potentially at the borders of Russia. So Japan had actually successfully defeated many of the Russian fleet, but it had cost them a great deal in lives and resources. So they actually went to the United States to try to help them negotiate a peace with Russia, which was very difficult for Japan to accept and do because Japan was one of our biggest competitors in the Pacific. So it's kind of going to your competitor asking for their help. It's not something that they necessarily wanted to do. But Teddy Roosevelt was happy to help negotiate a peace between Russia and Japan to try to maintain a system of balance in Asia, and also hoping to get the United States a closer step into China and into Asia in regards to trade. From there, though, he becomes, quote, the show off. Teddy Roosevelt is known for having the diplomacy of big stick diplomacy. He wants to show off the growing military strength of the United States. And one such thing as that is the Great White Fleet. He had 16 new naval battleships go on a tour around the world, and they were painted this bright white. And this is why it was called the Great White Fleet. It was to demonstrate the United States' growing military power, also demonstrating our amount of wealth and our industrial ability to build 16 new naval warships. But he used it as an intimidation factor against Europe and also against Europe or against Asian countries as he was starting to expand or help expand in the Pacific. And so he's going to use that same policy, that big stick diplomacy, in Latin America. So taking a look here, this is where Roosevelt the Forceful. The first instance where Roosevelt is going to use his big stick diplomacy is within Panama. The United States had wanted a waterway that would connect the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean for quite some time. It was very costly and very, costly in regards to money and costly in time for the United States to be able to get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean because we'd have to sail around the southern tip of South America to be able to reach either. And with the fact that we have a growing territories and expansion in the Atlantic as well as in the Pacific, we desperately needed a waterway that was going to connect those two major oceans. And so Panama seemed the likely place at the Isthmus of Panama. Issue is Panama was controlled by Colombia at the time. So a French canal company had actually gotten the rights from Colombia to start building the Panama Canal. However, the French canal company ran out of money, and also their workers suffered a great deal from yellow fever and malaria that they abandoned the project, and they actually sold their rights to the United States. Well, the United States tried to negotiate with Colombia to be able to build the canal, but Colombia wanted more money from the United States that the United States was not willing to pay. So this was not going to stop Roosevelt. Again, his idea of speak softly. He tried to negotiate with Colombia. They weren't willing to negotiate. So instead, he is going to use his big stick diplomacy, and he is going to support a local Panamanian rebellion. There were some Panamanians who wanted to rebel against Colombia and get their independence. And so Roosevelt saw this as his ticket to get to the canal. So he gives U.S. military and support, and the Great White Fleet is going to go off the coast of Panama there, and he's going to support the Panamanian rebels. The Panamanian rebels end up winning their independence from Colombia, And ultimately, as a thank you, they sign a treaty with the United States giving them exclusive rights to the canal zone. So the U.S. pays $10 million to Panama, and they also get to control the canal for the next 100 years. The canal is going to be very costly to build. It's going to be over $40 million to build, and it was a great engineering feat by U.S. engineers to be able to create the lock system that was going to be needed to be able to allow ships to travel. But it does become a success. It opens in 1914, just at the start of World War I, and it cuts off about 8,000 miles of travel for the United States, which is going to be crucial for their expanding navy, especially on the onset of World War I. One last thing that demonstrates Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy in Latin America was the creation of the Roosevelt Corollary. This was, again, to, in Roosevelt's eyes, protect American economic interests with his big stick diplomacy. It was in addition to the Monroe Doctrine. If you guys recall, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine, how it was a warning to European countries to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Well, the Roosevelt Corollary kind of goes a next step further and says that the United States can intervene in Latin American countries to prevent European influence within the Western Hemisphere. So, in one hand, we say it is not okay for Europe to get involved, but it is okay for the United States because we're there to maintain the best interest of the Latin American countries. And so the big thing here Roosevelt was addressing is the fact that many of the Latin American countries owed European countries money. They were in debt to them. And so he wanted to make them financially secure without fear of European influence in the territory. But if you look at this cartoon here, and we're actually going to take a closer look at it here, there's mixed reviews about the Roosevelt Corollary. You know, many people started to associate with Roosevelt as being the world's constable, the world's policeman, that the United States was, quote, the negotiator between Europe and Latin America. Many Latin American countries resented American involvement. They felt that it was a violation of their sovereignty, that they should be able to handle their own affairs. So this is where, you know, some people, some countries will accuse Roosevelt of overstepping. Okay, and the United States kind of abusing some of their growing strength that they have. So looking at the cartoon here, that new diplomacy, the emphasis there on the big stick diplomacy. The scroll there under his arm that says arbitration is the negotiation. You can see on the right, you've got the European countries kind of clamoring with Roosevelt to get access to the Latin American countries that are there on the left. Okay, the next policy, of course, after Roosevelt will be William Taft's. And Taft's diplomacy is known as dollar diplomacy. He continues to support the Roosevelt Corollary. He supports the idea that America should intervene in Latin America to make sure that that region remains stable and does not fall prey to the growing European powers. But he doesn't feel that it has to be military force that will help protect Latin America. He actually comes up with the phrase that he wants to substitute dollars for bullets. And he wants American businesses to invest in Latin America, getting them to build railroads, helping to Latin American companies build up themselves. And he figures if the United States invests money in this region, it will make them far more secure. And so one of the areas in particular that Taft focuses on with dollar diplomacy is in Nicaragua. They financially were in some turmoil. They owed money to European countries, so the United States intervened to try to bring stability to that country. And they also worked to replace European loans. The United States would pay off some of the Latin American countries' loans to Europe, so that way the Latin American countries had to owe money to the U.S. and not to the European countries. Okay, the last foreign policy here to focus on is that of Woodrow Wilson's, and his is known as moral diplomacy. So very different from big stick diplomacy and even dollar diplomacy. Wilson does not believe in imperialism. He does not believe that the United States should expand their borders or take over other territories. But he does think that the United States should use its power to spread democracy. And that's where the, quote, moral diplomacy comes in. He feels that, again, the United States is that model democratic country. And so they should help spread democracy to other countries around the world. This is going to be particularly evident in Mexico, and it is going to backfire on Wilson a little bit. Um, Mexico found themselves in some revolution and turmoil. Um, the um, the Mexican administration, presidency that had been in place, favored only about the top percent of the Mexican population. Vast majority of Mexican citizens were in poor economic situations, and they wanted that to change. So they overthrew the Mexican president, and General Victoriano Huerta. Huerta is going to seize power. He actually kills his opposition. And so he takes over power. But of course, he says that he's going to provide, job opportunities and resources for the vast majority of Mexican citizens. So while many Mexican citizens didn't support the way Huerta had assumed power by killing his, predecessor, he he's still, they're still hopeful that he does make the positive changes for the vast majority of public. Problem is Woodrow Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's administration because of the fact that he essentially killed the former leader to be able to take over power, which is going to create turmoil within Mexico. Huerta will eventually be overthrown. Wilson arms the opponents to Huerta and essentially places Carranza as president, which there were many Mexican citizens who didn't like Huerta, but they were all kind of united in they did not like U.S. involvement in their politics and determining who their leaders were going to be. So this is going to create a state of tension between Mexico and the United States. And we're going to see some anti-American riots and raids start to take place, particularly in the border towns there in the southwestern part of the United States. The picture just below Wilson's picture there is of a man by the name of Pancho Villa, and he is one of those anti-American leaders who's going to lead raids on the border towns, and he used guerrilla warfare. He actually ended up killing some American citizens in some of his raids, and so Wilson sent John J. Pershing to try to find Pancho Villa. And so American troops actually crossed the border into Mexico, which is a violation of Mexico's sovereignty in the hunt for Pancho Villa. They never found Pancho Villa, but this is just going to further strain the relationship between Mexico and the United States, which, when we get to World War I, is why the Zimmerman telegram was so significant, because this is why Germany went to Mexico. It wasn't by coincidence. They are feeding off of the state of tension between the United States and Mexico from Wilson's implementation of moral diplomacy. So, on your Latin American imperialism chart, you were to think about which type of foreign policy you felt was most effective in Latin America. So if you haven't turned that in, you still need to turn that in to me when you get that complete.